Welcome. I'm Pastor Branson Villardo, and this is the Bible in 10 minutes. Now, before we get started, a quick warning. We're going to cover things very quickly, and this video does assume some prior knowledge of the Bible. So if you have any questions about the topics or stories covered in this video, we have more great videos on our YouTube channel all about these topics in more depth, and we'll continue to release more videos along those lines in the days ahead. So be sure to check out our YouTube channel for more great content like this. Now, here we go. The Bible in 10 minutes. God starts by creating the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree that they're not supposed to, so they get kicked out of the garden. When they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel bring offerings unto God, but God doesn't like Cain's offering as much as he likes Abel's offering, so Cain gets jealous and kills Abel. Adam and Eve then have a third son named Seth, which Seth in the Hebrew just means replacement because Seth is Abel's replacement after Abel was killed by Cain. You fast forward a little bit to Genesis chapter 6, and you find out that evil has multiplied upon the earth. Things haven't gotten better, they've just gotten worse. People have gotten worse and worse. So God says, you know what? I'm going to start this thing all over with one man, and he chooses Noah. In order to start over with Noah, he sends a flood over the whole earth. The flood wipes out all of humanity, and God starts over with Noah. The problem is that Noah's not all that great either, and his descendants choose to create a tower so that they can make themselves greater than God. And what happens is, in Genesis chapter 11, you find out that they build a tower in Babel. It's called the Tower of Babel, to exalt themselves above God. And God says, you know what? I can't have humanity teaming up against me. I'm going to split them up. I'm going to change everybody's languages. And so he spreads them out, scatters them out all over the earth. And he decides again, I'm going to start over with another person. So God chooses Abraham, who's a very old man. And he says, Abraham, I'm going to start with you. Come to a land that I'm going to show you. God calls Abraham in Genesis 12. Abraham ultimately has a son named Isaac. There's not much in the Bible about Isaac apart from apart from Abraham having him, and God calling Abraham to sacrifice him, which Abraham is willing to in Genesis chapter 22. But God provides a replacement, as he will later in the Bible. You fast forward from there. He has Isaac. After Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's two main sons in the Bible, you get to Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson. Jacob is the one who has two wives, Rachel and Leah. He loves Rachel, doesn't love Leah quite as much as he loves Rachel. And then Jacob has a son named Joseph. Now what happens is this: Jacob and his family are in Israel, the land that God has called them to, the promised land, but there's a famine. And so when there's a famine, they go to Egypt, where Joseph, the 12 sons of Israel, their brother Joseph, has been sold into slavery. But Joseph is risen to the top, and so they come to Egypt, they find Joseph, and they choose to stay in Egypt because there's a famine in the land. Now what happens is this: after Joseph, there comes a new Pharaoh in Egypt who doesn't know Joseph. And the Bible says that that new Pharaoh chose to enslave all the children of Israel because they had moved there from the promised land because of the famine, because there was provision in Egypt. They're in slavery for 400 years, and the Bible says that after 400 years of slavery, they finally started to cry out to God. Now, just so you have a reference for timing, Abraham lived around 2000 BC. Moses ultimately lives around 1400 BC, 1300, 1400 BC. So there's about 700 years in there. 400 of them were spent in slavery, and then a couple hundred were spent in the generations from Abraham to Joseph to the time of slavery in Egypt. But like I said, around 1400 BC before Christ, you find that the children of Israel cry out to God for deliverance out of slavery. As they cry out to God for deliverance out of slavery, God raises up for them a deliverer. That's Moses. Moses takes them out of slavery in Egypt into the wilderness. He leads them around the wilderness. They get to the edge of the promised land. And you'll remember 2 spies come back with a good report of the promised land. 10 come back with an evil report. Those 2 spies with a good report are Caleb and Joshua. Ultimately, the children of Israel believe the evil report of the promised land, so they are sentenced to die in the wilderness. After that generation dies off in the wilderness, Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies with a good report, lead the new generation into the promised land. This happens generally, people believe, around 1200 BC, according to the timeline of the Bible. So around 1200 BC, the children of Israel go into the promised land led by Joshua and Caleb. After that, you have a period where God rules the children of Israel through different rulers that he would raise up from time to time depending on the challenge. Those people were called the judges. That's where you get people like Gideon, Samson and Delilah, that story. Different stories, if you remember Deborah and Barak, all sorts of stories like that. That's the time when the judges ruled Israel. Eventually, though, the children of Israel say, we want to be like all the other nations. We want a king. So after they say they want a king, God chooses the king to be Saul. Saul wasn't such a good king, wasn't able to wait for God. Now, real quickly, Saul's top advisor, you'll remember, is Samuel. Samuel was the last of the judges, and he anoints the first of the kings. So it goes from Samuel the last judge to Saul the first king. Saul is the first king, and then after Saul, God says Saul's out, and so God chooses David to be king over Israel. David's king over Israel, moves the capital to Jerusalem. Solomon, his son, becomes king over Israel and builds the temple. Now, Solomon has a son, and you remember Solomon's hallmark was that he was wise. The kingdom expanded. But Solomon's son isn't so wise. The children of Israel come to Solomon's son and they say, hey, can you make life a little bit easier for us? Which obviously was what God warned the children of Israel about having a king. He said, they're going to make life hard on you. They're going to tax you. They're going to put a heavy burden on you. So the children of Israel come to Solomon's son, whose name is Rehoboam. He's the king. This is David's grandson, and they say, Rehoboam, can you make things a little bit easier on us? And Rehoboam says, no, actually, I'm going to make things harder on you. He listens to young counsel rather than old counsel. He's not very wise. And so Jeroboam, a military leader, rises up and leads a rebellion. And what happens is the kingdom of Israel is split into two. You have the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Judah is two tribes. It's Judah and Benjamin. In the north, you have the other 10 tribes. Now, there's two different histories that take place from here. And again, David ruled around 1000 BC. So they're split into two. And then what happens is, I'm going to give you the history of the north really quick. The history of the north really quick first. You have Jeroboam leads the rebellion. He sets up golden calves, leads the northern 10 tribes into idol worship. Then after that, you have a bunch of kings. Some notable kings are Ahab and Jezebel. And around the time of Ahab and Jezebel, that's when you get the prophet Elijah, ultimately the prophet Elisha. You have Jeroboam II. But what happens is in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes from the north and takes out the northern 10 tribes. The northern 10 tribes are scattered, never to be gathered back together again until ultimately the fulfillment, but at least historically, they will be gathered back together in the future, but historically, they weren't gathered back together. And so during that time, obviously you have Elijah and Elisha are prophets to the north. You also have prophets like Amos and Hosea. But 722 BC is when that exile took place by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Now, at the same time, you have things happening in the south. You remember, Rehoboam was the king who was the son of Solomon. After him, a couple righteous kings, Asa and Jehoshaphat, two righteous kings. And then you have the king Hezekiah. Hezekiah is the king who was the king during the time of the prophet Isaiah, if you remember that. Hezekiah leads religious reforms. He leads the people of Judah out of idol worship into the worship of God. And you'll remember that King Sennacherib, who took out the north in 722 BC, got all the way to Jerusalem. He sent letters, read letters about how he was going to take out Jerusalem too, but Hezekiah prayed to God, and when Hezekiah prayed to God, an angel went and killed all the host of the Assyrians, and so Assyria had to retreat and couldn't take out the south in 722 BC. After Hezekiah, you have Josiah, who's a king who leads great religious reforms as well. It's a time of revival for the children of Judah. Then ultimately, they go back into evil, and you have the Babylonian exile, which takes place when Assyria took out the north in 722 BC, but Babylon comes, takes out the south in 586 BC. When Babylon takes out the south in 586 BC, that's when you get the prophet Jeremiah, who's called the weeping prophet because he was sad because the south was being taken out. Then they go into the Babylonian exile. Babylon doesn't scatter everybody. They just bring everybody to Babylon. And that's where you have prophets like Daniel and Daniel and Ezekiel prophesy to the exiles in Babylon. That's done by Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who leads that whole thing. But what happens is Persia comes and takes out Babylon. When Persia comes and takes out Babylon, which again, Babylon took out Israel in 586 BC. In 538 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia takes out Babylon and says, I'm going to let everybody from Judah go back to the homeland of Israel. So one of the first people to go back in 516 BC is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. You can read all about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was a priest. Nehemiah built the wall. That was around the time of 400s, 500s BC. Then you have a period of silence. Jesus comes on the scene about 4 BC is when we believe he was born. Jesus, obviously, he was ultimately crucified, resurrected. After Jesus is resurrected, things are handed over to the apostles. The apostles in Acts 2 take the thing over on the day of Pentecost. And then in Acts chapter 9, it goes from a Jewish thing to God calls the apostle Paul, and he calls the apostle Paul, take this gospel to the Gentiles as well. The gospel goes to the Gentiles, and then the Bible ends with the apostle Paul's letters, the apostle Peter's letters, and the apostle John's letters, and then ultimately you also have in the book of Revelation the apostle Paul's vision of what heaven will be like. There you have it. That's the Bible in 10 minutes. I pray this has been a blessing to you. Make sure you like the channel, subscribe to the channel, and check out more of our videos for great content like this. God bless you. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.